Good afternoon. I think we'll get started. I'm Sam Rushforth, the Dean of the College of Science and Health, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. You have a treat in front of you. We have Dr. Brian Moench on campus, who is the founder of the Physicians for a Healthy Environment. I've been working in clean air work for very many years, and it's been really interesting. Early on, it was quite hard to have physicians become interested, involved, and so forth, and that's changed, and it's largely changed due to Dr. Moench and others in his group. Dr. Moench is a chemist as well as a physician. He attended Stanford and the University of Utah for his medical degree. And he has worked in both in the East Coast for a residency, came back to Utah, and has been here since. He's an anesthesiologist and in private practice in Utah. He did teach at the Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School as well, but he's now in private practice and at the Intermountain Health Center. He's the president and founder of the Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment, as I mentioned, and I can't tell you how important this is. It's really critical that we've had the physicians come on board, and Brian has made a wonderful contribution to the state and to the country, and we're beginning to understand now that air pollution is more important than we ever thought before, as is water pollution and other forms. But it's really disastrously problematic, and so Dr. Moench is going to talk with us about that today. The title of his for today's symposium is Smothering Utah's Future, the Pollution Consequences of Climate, Growth, and Energy Development. And before we start, we have a poster that we made up for today, which is kind of commemorates the lecture, but we also have let's see if that holds. We also have a pointer that is really terrific. I love mine. This is one of those green pointers that is very bright, and actually if you take it outside on a dark evening, you can follow the trail 1,000 feet or more into the air and actually point out a constellation. So I get a kick out of it. So it's kind of my favorite toy. So we're giving Brian one of these. So anyway, would you help me welcome Dr. Moench to our campus?
Thanks, Sam. Sam, would this pointer have settled the issue of what was that mysterious missile that went off in California a couple days ago that everybody's all in a buzz about? Let's see. Am I disqualified if I have to ask which end I have to hold? Apparently, there we go. Okay. Those of us who are involved in life-saving medicine and surgery always have to have a backup plan if things don't go well. So I've learned to always have a backup talk if things don't go well and I misread my audience. So I'm going to give you a choice between two talks, and you raise your hands and tell me which one you want. This one is entitled Fun with Air Pollution. This one is entitled, Oh my God, We're All Gonna Die. So by show of hands, who wants to hear Fun with Air Pollution? And who wants to hear, Oh my God, We're All Gonna Die? Okay, I take no responsibility for the outcome because you voted for this talk. So you're gonna get it. Now it's been kind of a bad week for environmentalists. Ever since the election, I've kind of been a little bit depressed because it didn't seem like we elected very many officials with an environmental sympathy or insight, and perhaps this was hit me over the head like a rock yesterday when I read this title. This politician is a representative from Illinois who is poised to be the chairman of the Energy Subcommittee And his only rival is Representative Joe Barton from Texas, who was the one who famously apologized to British Petroleum for having our ocean get in the way of their oil spill. So you might appreciate the fact that this has been a little bit discouraging, but because this whole talk can be very depressing, I have to kind of liven it up a little bit. So I did enjoy some of the signs that were displayed at the Washington, D.C. rally to restore sanity conducted by Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert. So I wanted to share a couple with you because it's hard to get laughs in this sort of business. This is one of my favorite. If screaming makes you right, then the 3-year-old down the street is a freaking genius. What do we want? Patience. When do we want it? Now. I'm loud, therefore I'm right. That seems to be the political mantra of the moment. This is actually one of my favorite. I don't have a dream so much as a mild preference. I hate myself and my liberal agenda. I actually have that poster above my bed. And I'm somewhat irritated about extreme outrage. And lastly, people who use hyperbole should be shot, and God hates signs. Well, I agree with all those sentiments. And this is obviously one of my favorite. I'm not Christine O'Donnell, I'm just a witch. We're going to talk a little bit about politics as well as public health because first and foremost, this is a discussion about public health, but it also has to be, almost by default, a discussion about politics as well, because many of the problems related to the public health consequences of environmental degradation are political in nature. Certainly the solutions are all too often political in nature as well. So it's hard to really talk about one without the other. And so in the course of talking about any subject that has a political overtone, you're likely to offend a lot of people. And I intend to offend just about everybody here. And in fact, when I'm done, if I haven't offended you, raise your hand and I'll try and insult you personally when we're all finished. What we're going to talk about is Smothering Utah's future. This is not a photoshopped picture. This was taken 2009 above Temple Square in Salt Lake City. What you're seeing there is not the celestial kingdom. It is not a heavenly mist. It is air pollution, deadly air pollution. And I want you to know that the patron saint of our group is the famed environmentalist Dr. Stephen Colbert, who has initiated this effort that you may be somewhat familiar with to keep fear alive. And my intent is to very much try and keep fear alive here in Utah County, especially of air pollution. So I'm going to try and scare the daylights out of you. Now, in particular, it's worth noting that the World Health Organization calculates that environmental degradation is responsible for about 30% of all chronic disease worldwide, 80% of cancer, and contributes to 80% of chronic diseases in general. Now, what's going on in the state now is the development of an energy policy at the behest of Governor Herbert to try and direct how the state's going to handle our energy pursuits, whether or not we're going to develop fossil fuels like oil shale, tar sands, continue a rapidly increased rate of oil and gas drilling, whether or not we're going to develop nuclear. There's probably no greater influence on public health than overall environmental degradation and air pollution in particular. In fact, air pollution probably has a greater effect on public health than smoking does. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So to the extent that we engineer our energy policy one way or the other, it really becomes a de facto public health policy. And that's really what I'd like to emphasize today, is that we're going to be making some choices as a state, as citizens, in the next probably year or so, that are going to have long-term consequences on the livability of this state for you and your children and grandchildren. When I was reading the reports of the Gulf oil spill, I got very depressed and started thinking, what are we turning this world into? And I had just watched for the, I don't know how many times, Lord of the Rings, and thought, we're turning our planet into Mordor. The mythical industrial wasteland that you're hopefully somewhat familiar with. And so I started thinking about what Utah is going to be doing in the near future to establish what our energy policies are going to be. And so I thought I'd continue with this sort of theme for a minute. You're going to hear from politicians, and you've had probably an opportunity to hear politicians commonly make this kind of phrase. We need a balanced approach to our energy choices. That sounds good. Balanced sounds good. Not only in gymnastics, but balance sounds like a good term. Well, let me ask you this. What is a balanced smoking habit? 5 cigarettes a day? 10? 20? 0? What's a balanced smoking habit? The term obviously doesn't have any relevance to that particular issue at all. What's a balanced approach to honoring your marriage vows? A little bit of cheating, succumbing to temptation once a week, twice a week. What's a balanced approach to that issue? Well, it's kind of a meaningless term. I suggest that balanced approach is meaningless here as well. You're going to hear this term. We should take a middle-of-the-road approach, as if the middle of any road is always a good place to be. Well, the middle of this road wasn't a very good place to be. Having been in that situation myself on my bicycle riding to work, I can tell you the middle of the road is not a place you want to be most of the time. You're going to hear the term responsible development. We should develop our fossil fuel resources responsibly. How does one injure other people responsibly? How does one text and drive at the same time responsibly? In this context, the term responsible really doesn't apply either. You're going to hear this term, let's keep our energy affordable. If your affordable energy anonymously sacrifices the lives of other people, for whom is it affordable? These terms really don't apply to this particular issue, and so I'd like to warn you in advance, you're going to hear these terms when our energy choices are discussed in the media by local politicians. But I would urge you not to be swept up in the attractiveness of the idea that these are comforting terms, but in this case, they really have virtually no meaning. Let's look at China to get an idea of what Mordor may actually appear on Earth. Because of the rapid industrialization of China, they have literally created an environmental nightmare. Now they're starting to slowly realize what they've done, but at the moment, they have the majority of the world's worst air pollution in their major cities. The consequences of the pollution they've created have been calculated to actually cost economically almost the entirety of China's GDP, which is estimated to be about 10%. If you were to factor in the health consequences of all that pollution, it would virtually eliminate the economic impact of their GDP. Somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people die annually every year in China because of their air pollution. And that picture is one of Shanghai, and that's how frequently their air actually looks and feels. And I've been to China a couple of years ago during the Olympics, and it's really that bad. Now, by comparison, the urban areas of the Wasatch Front consistently rank in the top 10 worst cities in the country for acute spikes in air pollution. The American Lung Association gives us the grade of F, and by us I mean the urban areas of the Wasatch Front, and that includes Provo, Salt Lake City, and Logan. The American Lung Association gives us the grade of F for the two most important components of air pollution, particulate matter and ozone. This past winter, Salt Lake City exceeded the national ambient air quality standards, which are set by the EPA, 46 times. Now, here's a concept I'd like you to take home. This is not a fraternity stunt, although I'm sure it will be now that I've shown this picture. There is no safe level of air pollution. In the same way that there is no safe number of cigarettes that you can smoke, there is no safe amount of air pollution that you can breathe. Physiologically, air pollution actually mimics cigarette smoke. And if you were to try and quantitate it, the amount of air pollution that we're all exposed to by living along the Wasatch Front is comparable to what you would be exposed to if you lived with an active smoker. And that's about maybe 25% of the full impact of smoking cigarettes yourself. Now, here's the difference. Air pollution doesn't just affect adults, doesn't affect just college students, it affects everyone. Obviously, it affects little children. And as repulsive as this picture should be to anyone, it should also be equally repulsive to entertain the thought that little children have to breathe air pollution as well, because it has a bigger effect on them, and especially children who are developing in their mother's womb. Air pollution affects every single organ system, primarily by creating an inflammatory response that affects the arterial system. Every single organ you have needs an arterial supply. So to the extent that your arterial supply is compromised by a low-grade inflammation, then every single organ that you have is affected by air pollution. And the organs that are the most affected are the ones that have the highest metabolic rate and the most marginal blood supply, and that happens to be your heart, your brain, your lungs, and in the case of a pregnant female, the placenta. Now, if I were to ask someone here, in fact, maybe I will, Sam, name your 3 favorite organs.
I like my heart, my brain, and another one.
Okay, all right. I'm not going to tell you what he said. But I like my heart, my brain, and my lungs. Those are my favorite organs. You all have your different favorite organs, I'm sure. But the point is, the most critical organs are the ones that are actually the most at risk from air pollution, because by and large, they have the highest metabolic rate and the most vulnerable blood supply. Pollution affects the lungs of small children in that it curtails the development of their lung capacity, such that if you're a child who grows up along the Wasatch Front, we know from medical data that's very robust now that you'll never develop your full lung capacity. When I tell an audience of parents that if you have a child now and you have aspirations for them to be an Olympic athlete in an endurance sport, unfortunately, just by growing up here along the Wasatch Front, they'll never make it. You should see their jaws drop. They don't want to hear that. But unfortunately, air pollution exposure in those formative years while your lungs are developing actually stunts your lung growth permanently, such that you'll never get your full lung capacity by having had that exposure when your lungs were growing. And so that's unfortunately true. You will probably never have an Olympic athlete if they grow up and breathe the kind of air pollution that we're exposed to. For women, the impact on their heart seems to be worse than men. In fact, a study in probably the world's most prestigious medical journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, shows that the kind of air pollution exposure that middle-aged women have, postmenopausal women have along the Wasatch Front, is almost as great as the cardiac risk that they would incur were they to be active smokers. Now, there's speculation as to why women are more at risk. It may be that their coronary arteries are smaller, but the take-home message here is that women are particularly vulnerable to this. If you look at what air pollution does at the cellular level, it is virtually astounding in that it causes, if it's small enough particles, it actually can penetrate every single cell in your body, causing oxidative stress, which is a fancy term for basically not quite enough blood supply for the functioning of your cell organ, or the tiny components of your cell. It can cause mitochondrial dysfunction, and it can cause altered phagocytic function. Phagocytes are the white blood cells that scoop up impurities. It can cause actual DNA damage, both an altering of the DNA sequence if it's severe enough, but it can also cause epigenetic changes, which is basically little molecules attached to your DNA. Air pollution penetrates virtually every cell in your body. So that's a concept I want to leave with you as well. To whatever extent we allow our environment to be degraded and expose ourselves to pollution, every cell in your body will be exposed. Well, that has some profound consequences, especially for the developing embryo. And in fact, air pollution probably has its biggest impact on public health through the impact it has on the developing human embryo. And we know that it causes actual genetic changes, chemical attachments to your genes, such that when proteins have to come up next to the chromosomes and read those chromosomes in order to create the other kinds of proteins needed for the functioning of that cell, say if it's a heart cell and it needs to create heart muscle, if those proteins come up against the DNA trying to read that and they can't read it exactly, it's like trying to play Mozart with gloves on. It just can't do it as well. And so that's why the human embryo is most at risk for pollution exposure, and whatever the mother is exposed to, the fetus is exposed to as well. How many of you know who this person is? Come on, you can admit it. I know more of you know who this is than that. I wouldn't have known, but my wife pointed it out. This is Lady Gaga. Okay. So, most of you are lying. I know most of you know who this is. Okay. I'm just going to take that as a given. Most of you know who this is. How many of you know who this is? This is Lady Gaga before she had plastic surgery. No, actually it's not. How many of you know who this is? Nobody. That's just what I thought. How many of you know who this is? Nobody. And that's just exactly what I thought. Well, I think it's a sad commentary on our society that we all know who Lady Gaga is, but none of us know who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine last year. Elizabeth Blackburn, Carol Greeter, and Jack Szostak won the Nobel Prize last year in medicine for their research on telomeres. How many of you know what telomeres are? Okay, a few of you know what telomeres are. The winners of the Nobel Prize in Medicine won it for their research on telomeres and telomerase. Let me just describe to you a little bit about telomeres for those of you who don't know. Telomeres are the repeating sequences of DNA at the ends of your chromosomes that serve the kind of function that the end caps on shoelaces do, which is they keep your shoelaces from unraveling and getting tangled up and mixed in with other shoelaces and keep your shoes on your feet. Well, telomeres perform the same kind of function. Every time your cell divides, it loses a little bit of telomere length, such that the longevity of that particular cell is limited by the fact that it can only divide so many times because the telomeres keep getting shortened every time it divides. And when it finally reaches the point where it doesn't have enough telomere left, the cell dies. So that's why one of the reasons why people don't live forever. Telomerase is an enzyme that helps maintain telomere activity. Now, if an organism has lived long past its usefulness and should be otherwise on the verge of death, but has good telomerase activity, then you can have that organism live long past the point that it should have died. And the best example of that would be, of course, Keith Richards. I really want to know what he's doing for the telomerase activity that he's got. But back to telomeres. Air pollution can shorten telomere length, accelerating the aging process at the cellular level. So if you look at a person's cell underneath the microscope, you can actually tell how old they are physiologically by looking at the length of their telomeres. And people who are occupationally exposed to air pollution actually have shorter telomeres, such that if you're in an occupation where you're exposed to air pollution on a regular basis, you can probably have telomere length shortened about as much as you would from the aging process alone of about maybe 10 years. And believe me, if you're 10 years older than you should be under the microscope, no amount of plastic surgery can make up for that. So that's a big deal. It's hard to really overstate the impact this has. It has the impact that we've talked about on organ systems, but it also has this profound impact at the very smallest subcellular level of human existence. Well, how do these issues about what's happening to Utah's future relate to all of this? I'm concerned that politically we're on the course to put us all into even more trouble than we already are and magnify the public health consequences that we already experience. There are plans, and you can see it right now, billions of dollars being spent on an expansion of I-15, basically to facilitate more automobile traffic. There are plans on the books to create virtually a new city west of the airport in Salt Lake City, between that and the Great Salt Lake, of about 300,000 people. You've heard about plans to build a bridge on Utah Lake and plans for new cities on the west side of Utah Lake. You've heard about expansion plans for the Legacy Highway and a proposal for a new huge paper mill on the shores of Utah Lake. I'm going to talk about these in a minute in case you haven't heard much of it, but we're looking at the possibility of having an enormous amount of increase in the dust that we experience from the West Desert if the Snake Valley water grab is allowed. We're already seeing increased dust storms from a depleted Great Salt Lake. We're having such an accelerated pace of increase in oil and gas drilling in eastern Utah and western Colorado that the amount of air pollution generated by that activity is going to affect the air we breathe here along the Wasatch Front. There are plans, obviously, to accommodate hundreds of thousands of more people and all the cars that they drive. So if we have a problem now and all of these things develop, we're going to have a real problem on our hands, and we will be fairly close to what I described here earlier as maybe creating a new Mordor. We're going to have higher ozone levels, more wildfires, more mercury, more radioactivity, more erionite, which you probably don't know about, and we'll talk about it in just a second. Let me address some of these things right here. This is the anti-air pollution. This is actually the Orion Nebula as viewed from the Hubble telescope. This is a total absence of air pollution, and I just put that in there so in case any of you are falling asleep, that maybe you'd see that, yes, air pollution, or the lack of it, can be beautiful. Now, Sarah Palin says she can see this from her house. I'm not so sure, but we're going to have more dust storms like this one, Phoenix, 2007, for a variety of reasons. Since 1999, the Great Salt Lake has dropped 7 feet. Now, if you look at that satellite picture of the Great Salt Lake, you see all those white areas around the lake. That's basically dry beach now, what used to be lake. Every time the wind blows across this dry beach, we're going to get dust, and we do, dust storms generated from that. As temperatures increase and our precipitation drops, that area obviously will also be increased. There's a company called the Great Salt Lake Minerals Corporation that has a business where they are allowed to create settling ponds from Great Salt Lake, allows the water to evaporate, and then they scoop up the minerals, phosphate, potassium, things like that, and sell it as a fertilizer. They have applied to expand their operations 300%. If they are allowed to do that, that will drop the level of the Great Salt Lake another 2 feet, exposing more beach and exposing all of us to more of the dust from that beach. There are plans to build a water diversion project called the Bear River Project. And that is primarily an attempt to get water from somewhere to fuel more growth along the Salt Lake Valley. In particular, this proposed development that I mentioned a few minutes ago, which, there we go. This is the area of the supposed northwest quadrant, west of the airport, south of the Great Salt Lake. If that, in fact, becomes a city of 300,000 people, they'll need water. Well, this grand scheme at the moment is to take water from the Bear River. Well, the Bear River supplies about 70% of the surface water of the Great Salt Lake. So if you divert the Bear River, you're certainly going to sacrifice the size of the Great Salt Lake even further and magnify the problems that I've already mentioned. The Snake Valley water grab. How many of you know anything about that proposal? Good, I'm glad you do, because we're going to spend just a couple of minutes on that. The Snake Valley water grab, very simply, is the brainchild of this person, Pat Mulroy, the general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. And this proposal is that Nevada, in particular Las Vegas, be allowed to mine the water out of the aquifers underneath western Utah and eastern Nevada and ship that water to Las Vegas. We're talking about a land area as great as the state, or in size, as the state of Vermont. Well, if they're allowed to mine that water out of the desert, all the plants that depend on that water will obviously be sacrificed. And you may not think that the desert out there has a lot of vegetation, but it does. And most of it survives because of these aquifers. So everyone who has any basic appreciation of biology or ecology knows that this is a potential disaster, and the principal victim will be Utah, because they are looming to create virtually another dust bowl. Those people are smart enough to know that that's what, in fact, will happen, but they don't seem to care. And their attitude at this point is, well, trust us, what could go wrong? Kind of reminds me of, sorry to Ms. Mulroy, but that's kind of what her approach reminds me of, is the Wicked Witch of Nevada, because a lot could go wrong. And in fact, we have some historical examples to show us, in fact, what could go wrong. Well, here's one of them. This is a satellite photo of the Aral Sea in Uzbekistan. In 1960, it was the fourth largest freshwater lake on Earth. Somebody had the great idea that we'll divert the inlet to the Aral Sea and use that to create new agricultural areas. And they did. And over the course of the next 40 years, the Aral Sea shrank to this, 1/10 of its previous size. Well, what has happened is exactly what we're now starting to experience in the Great Salt Lake. All that former lake bed covered with water is now dry sand. And it blows in the area, exacerbating their air pollution, and the average life expectancy of the person who lives in that area has dropped 4 years, due primarily to throat and esophageal cancers, because presumably of the newly created dust bowl from this water project. Well, this is what the Aral Sea now looks like at the ground. Literally boats abandoned in sand dunes. Well, that's one of the things that could go wrong. Here's the Owens Lake. Now, I don't know how many of you know the story of the Owens Lake, but when Los Angeles decided in the early 1900s they needed water, they went to Owens Lake. They bought up the water rights, and they basically created a scheme to drain what was, at the time, a very beautiful lake and send that water to Los Angeles. Well, what could go wrong? They created a new dust bowl. And now the Owens Valley is the single largest source of particulate matter air pollution in the United States, has had the highest levels of air pollution ever recorded in this country. And in fact, one of the emergency room doctors of the closest town, Keeler, California, which is about 60 miles away, made this statement: when we see the white cloud headed down the pass, the ER and doctor's offices fill up with people who suddenly got worse. It's a pretty straightforward cause and effect. So we've created a dust bowl in the Owens Valley. We know what these projects do, and yet Nevada is fighting fiercely to be able to do that to us. We know that global warming will cause an exacerbation of our dust storms as well, and I want to spend a few minutes on global warming. To everybody other than the Fox News Academy of Sciences, global warming is actually a very serious issue. And when some pundits use these kinds of phrases, I think it is a serious disservice to the country to try and minimize or deny any sort of, or I should say, impugn the motives of people who are trying to warn the country about, not only the country, but the planet about what we're facing. My apologies to any Glenn Beck supporters. I want to talk just briefly about the International Panel on Climate Change. We don't have time to go into it in depth, but I want to give you just an overview. It is the largest collaborative scientific effort ever undertaken by mankind, involving more scientists than any project has ever had participate. It's over 1,000 pages long. It is the compilation of over 6,000 studies, and these were all done obviously prior to 2007 when this was published. Since then, another round of very important data corroborating all of their conclusions has been published. All of the scientific academies of all the major countries in the world concur that this is real. All the national academies of these countries, all the earth sciences organizations, these are international organizations, all the international earth science organizations, all the core physical sciences and their organizations, the biological sciences, even the health scientists. Even in the medical literature now, we are being told that it's high time physicians stood up and declared global warming the biggest public health risk that we have ever faced. So that's in part one of the reasons why I'm here. The World Health Organization, even the very conservative American Medical Association has signed off onto this. All in all, 80 scientific organizations have officially taken statements that this is a human-caused, very serious problem threatening the future of all of us. The number of dissenting scientific organizations is 0. So the score is 80-0. Now, if you're going to bet your future on a basketball game and one team is ahead 80-0 with 1 minute left in the fourth quarter, where do you want to put your nest egg? If you want to put it with the team that's behind 80-0, I think you'd see that maybe that represents some flawed logic. 98% of the climate scientists, people who really are the experts on this issue, concur this is real and extremely threatening to everyone's future. So is it science or science fiction? This is actual, real science. What you hear on television is frequently science fiction, unfortunately. Now, what this does not reflect are, and these are press releases of scientific studies published in the last year that are even more alarming. The first one from the journal Nature Geoscience, a study concluded that ocean dead zones, that is, i.e. devoid of fish and seafood entirely, are expanding and will remain dead for thousands of years. Another study, oceans are acidifying 10 times faster than 55 million years ago when a mass extinction of marine species occurred. And just in the last couple of months, global warming is now apparently the cause for a decrease in the ocean's phytoplankton concentrations of 40% since 1950. Now, the author's conclusion at the bottom of this was, microscopic life crucial to the marine food chain is dying out. The consequences could be catastrophic. I think it's fair to say, if we actually finish off the oceans in terms of destroying the ecosystem and eliminating marine life, then we will jeopardize our own survival. Marine life actually contributes half of the oxygen to this planet. And their conclusions were, if we ignore these results, it is at our gravest peril. So this brings up the question of scientific certainty, because we're all asked to say, in various times, we need more scientific certainty in order to be able to act on these issues. Well, this is a very familiar sort of appeal, and there's a historical precedent for it. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember that cigarettes used to be advertised by physicians. And as a result of the medical community being hoodwinked, if you will, into supporting the tobacco industry actually got a free ride from the government, perhaps as long as 30 to 40 years longer than the research suggested they should. But they came up with this ingenious campaign. We need scientific certainty in order to declare that smoking really is bad for you. They say that the correlation between smoking and heart disease and lung cancer is not enough. We need to have a mechanism. And with that argument, they bought themselves another probably 20 years of regulation-free activity and selling to the public. They did the same thing with the issue of exposure to secondhand smoke. They bought themselves about another 15 to 20 years of not regulating secondhand smoke with the same sort of appeal. We need scientific certainty. They called it junk science to declare that smoking was actually bad for people. And it was a campaign that actually worked. Since the 1930s, we knew that lead was an intense neurotoxin and actually killed people. The Ethyl Corporation put out a lead additive, and everyone used to drive cars that were on leaded gasoline until the mid-90s. Well, we had the medical data that lead was very neurotoxic, and in fact, the Ethyl Corporation had 17 fatalities in their own facility regarding lead toxicity. They knew what they were doing, but they still put out the product until about the mid-1980s, when finally pressure became overwhelming for us to get lead out of our gasoline. They then took the product and are now still selling leaded gasoline overseas. The amount of lead that we were all exposed to, my generation, was significant. Significant to the point of, we estimate now that the amount of IQ loss that all of us who grew up in the era of leaded gasoline was probably about 6 points on average. Well, I don't know about you, but I need every one of my 6 points of IQ. But we lost that from lead exposure. But this was a deliberate campaign by the Ethyl Corporation to say we need more scientific certainty before we can act. Asbestos, the same sort of thing. We knew about the dangers of asbestos as early as 1930, but because of the political clout of the asbestos industry, it actually is still legal to sell it, although most of the asbestos being sold now is sold out of this country. And when people like Sean Hannity say we must have scientific certainty before we can act, I think we need to ask people like that, would you be willing to insulate your house with asbestos? Because we have the same kind of certainty now on climate change that we have on asbestos, that we have on leaded gasoline. Now, the campaign to actually undermine the science of global warming is funded by a couple of the usual suspects, ExxonMobil and Koch Industries. And in fact, if you want a detailed analysis of what they've done in terms of funding the campaign to deny this, and this is an excellent book that I would recommend to all of you. But a couple of points are worth making. When companies callously and deliberately endanger the lives of others, or excuse me, when people callously endanger the lives of others, we call them psychopaths. But when corporations do, we actually call it making a profit. I think there's something wrong with that sort of construct. Deniers of climate change have failed in the last 15 years to produce one single peer-reviewed scientific journal that challenges the theory and evidence of human-induced climate change. This is one of those situations where you can definitely say the game is over. The answer is in. The scientists know what they're talking about. If we required the level of scientific certainty on climate change that all these deniers are asking, we would be unable to regulate virtually anything. Anything that we know is deadly: tobacco, lead, mercury, asbestos, dioxins, nuclear radiation, DDT, formaldehyde, benzene. our air pollution regulations, our regulation of pesticides, our regulation of dangerous pharmaceuticals. None of that has achieved a level of scientific certainty beyond what we already have with climate change. So if we're going to demand that level of certainty, we really can't demand any regulations on anything. This is a field that I know a little bit about, the field of medicine and surgery. There is nothing perfect in medicine. No diagnostic tool is 100% perfect. No surgery has an outcome who's guaranteed. If we delay medical care to people until we know for certain what our problem is and what the solutions are, what the answer, what the surgery is required, what drugs they need to take, if we delay medical care until we get that level of certainty, we would not be able to practice medicine at all. So if Rush Limbaugh, one of the most famous deniers in the country, comes into the emergency room with the kind of certainty that he demands of climate scientists, we would really be forced to say, I'm sorry, Mr. Limbaugh, about your chest pain. But because we can't be 100% certain what it is, and we can't be 100% certain what the treatments are, we really can't do anything for you. It obviously makes no sense. Well, what we're looking at now is virtual wholesale destruction of our forests. There are now 26 million acres of forests that have been destroyed in the interior west of the United States from the pine bark beetle directly related to global warming. At the rate that the pine bark beetle is destroying the forests of British Columbia, they will be 80% gone in another 3.5 years. The forest fires season is now 79 days longer than it used to be. 8 out of the last 10 seasons have been extreme fire seasons for Canada and Siberia. Forest fires thousands of miles away affect the air quality here along the Wasatch Front. And now we're finding actually that wildfire pollution is perhaps many times more toxic than even the air pollution that we commonly breathe from fossil fuel combustion. Hotter temperatures will bring higher ozone levels because the chemical reaction in the atmosphere that creates ozone is actually temperature dependent. So as the Earth warms, we'll have higher ozone. We'll have more air pollution from that alone. Less precipitation will decrease the rate of pollution dispersion, again, increasing our air pollution. The rate of natural gas drilling in the interior west is increasing at such a pace that just the pollution from that process will be the equivalent of the pollution of 13 million cars, which are the number of cars there are in Los Angeles. And some of that will get to the Wasatch Front. We just found out that, according to the Associated Press, the refineries nationally are now putting out 10 times the amount of pollution that they're supposed to and that we thought they were. And we have 5 refineries in North Salt Lake. Already the largest single source of pollution along the Wasatch Front is Kennecott, responsible for about 30% of our overall air pollution. They've asked to expand their operations 27%. We're expecting, in fact, we even talk about more urban sprawl, enough maybe for 1 million more people to come here along the Wasatch Front in the next 20 years. Vehicles miles traveled usually increase about 3 times faster than the population increases itself. How many of you have read any of Jared Diamond, the Pulitzer Prize-winning anthropologist's books? One of his books, Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, is something you should all read because he emphasizes that one of the reasons why societies have collapsed is because of their poor understanding and disregard for the environmental consequences of their civilization. He uses the Mayans, for example, how they ignored the fact that they were cutting down all their forests, their soil was eroding, and they had used up their water resources until it was too late really to do anything about it. And that same pattern has occurred over and over and over again. And it looks to us like we're not really learning that lesson. But some people are learning that lesson a little bit. Let's go back to China to wrap up. China, the people in China now understand what pollution is doing to their health. And there's a little town of about 7,000 people in China where the main factory is a factory that produces components for your flat screen TVs. And I want you to think about this every time you look at your beautiful flat screen TV. Well, the consequences of this factory operation were intense heavy metal, especially lead pollution to the community, and people started realizing that they were being poisoned. Cancer rates skyrocketed. Their children, when they finally got tested, showed the entirety of all their children under the age of about 12 showed intense lead toxicity. Nothing was being done about it. When they realized that they were going to have to take matters into their own hands, they stormed the factory, shut it down, and they spray painted these words on the walls of that factory. Give us back our green hills, our clean water, our fresh air. Give us justice. We want to live. I sincerely hope that the citizens of Utah will not wait until things get that bad before we decide that we must fight for the things that we want in terms of protecting our environment, because to whatever extent we protect our environment, we protect our own health, even at the microscopic level. I don't want us to get to the point where we have to have a riot here and say, give us back our green hills, our clean water, our fresh air, give us justice, we want to live. Let's deal with it before that. I'd like to suggest you do two things. The above email address is the email address of Becky Larkhart, who is the newly elected Speaker of the House, who I understand has a nursing background, lives in Utah County. And I'd like you to write down that address and say, I'm concerned about where we're headed in terms of the pollution in our environment and the amount of pollution that I personally and my family will be exposed to. Are you going to help take Utah in a direction where we're going to actually pursue resolution of those kinds of problems? The second email address you see there is the address of the governor. And I'd like you to tell him that you're concerned about any energy policy that continues our drift towards more and more fossil fuel dependency, because you've heard a lecture and your personal investigation tells you that your own personal health and that of your future family depends on us heading in a different direction. Thank you. Any questions?
Some of you have to leave, I know, but we do have time for a few questions.
Not that I could see anybody's hand, but yes.
Where you're saying we should go in a different direction, I was just wondering what direction you would suggest we should go in, just because I'm not very aware of all the other options. I just don't know much about it.
Well, we have to seriously make a major commitment, virtually right now, to develop our wind and solar and geothermal capabilities. Not only for our own personal health, but because most of our fossil fuels, and I didn't address this because there's just too much to talk about, most of our fossil fuels are actually on the decline in terms of what we can get at. So even if you ignored everything that I said today, our fossil fuel resources are running out. We're going to have to develop these others. And we don't do that unless we actually provide some sort of governmental incentives and support structure to do that. So, short answer to your question is wind, solar, geothermal. Nuclear carries its own risk, and that's a whole nother lecture, but the answer is not nuclear. The answer is these others. The idea that they're too expensive is really a miscalculation of the accounting system, because of all the health consequences I just talked about. You never see that with your electricity bill. You see it when you visit the doctor, you see it when your own life is shortened, but you don't see the consequences on your electricity bill. That's why people say, isn't it great that our energy's cheap? Well, no, it actually isn't cheap. You just pay for it in a different way. Someone behind you had a question. Yes.
Okay, I think my question is that I have two questions. Actually. Number gas.
Yes,
Okay, that kind of gas mining. Is that is happening in Utah?
Well, actually 90% of all the new natural gas drilling involves the fracking process. Yes, it will be coming to Utah unless we put pressure on our political leaders to put some restraints on it. So if you saw the movie Gasland and were overwhelmed by the depiction of residents being able to light their faucets on fire, that's obviously very startling. But it's obviously a health disaster if that's what our water supply is reduced to. So if we don't want that to happen in Utah, then we actually have to be engaged and try and prevent that sort of technique from becoming commonplace. But unfortunately, it is the most common technique now used for natural gas drilling.
The second part of this is the conservatism. Like conservative movement actually love life, like unborn children, anti-abortion and those kind of things. But on the other hand, it supports money. That the technology that is available right now, instead of the technology that can actually save life. So there is a disconnect. So how this disconnect? If I love life of this and life of that also. But why is this disconnect, and how we can actually address this disconnect?
You've described one of my pet peeves. Anybody who claims to be pro-life should also claim to be vigilant in protecting the development of our children, especially in utero, when the critical formative stages of organ development, especially their brain, are taking place. We should be hyper-vigilant about protecting the environment so these children have an opportunity to avoid the consequences of the pollution that we talked about earlier. If you are a pro-life person, you should be a pro-environment person, is my position. And unfortunately, as I think you pointed out, they frequently aren't found in the same politicians. And that's a shame. I think it's a real inconsistency. Yes?
So technically, in order to make it better for the next generation, it needs to start with us, ideally. So what should we be doing as individuals? Yes, we should be asking and trying to get the support of our government, but just asking and waiting for someone else to make the change isn't going to do anything. So what do we as individuals need to do?
Well, I think you should try and tailor your lifestyle to one that actually is individually less dependent on fossil fuels. As a result of this, for instance, and unless the weather's really awful, but by that I mean snowing, I try and bike to work. I've put down only about 1,000 miles on my car in the last 9 months because of that. That's in response to knowing what I know about this. I'd like to encourage other people to do the same. We have a campaign we'd like to get more public traction for, which we call 55, 65, 75, which is drive 55 on the freeway, because you save about 20% in your fuel, or improve your fuel efficiency about 20% compared to driving 75, which is what everybody really drives. And so you're not only going to use less fuel, you're going to pollute less, you're also going to save yourself some money. Turn the thermostat down to 65 in the winter, turn it up to 75 in the summer, and you can save a significant amount of fossil fuel consumption with those kinds of personal lifestyle changes that I just described. I'd like to encourage you to do that. Yes?
Primary factor driving this is the human population increase. How do we address that?
That's what, I mean, if this were an easily solved problem, we would have solved it probably. But the first step to solving the problem is to acknowledge the problem and to understand the breadth of the problem. And I think my primary goal here is to help you understand the breadth of the public health consequence of this issue. Not that there aren't other consequences. There are. There are a lot of them. National security consequences. How much resources do we really have? All of those things. But my main objective is to try and help you understand at least better the breadth of the public health part of this issue. And if you understand that better, then maybe we can improve people's motivation to actually engage themselves in a solution. Yes?
You mentioned Pat Mulroy and the whole mining the aquifer issue.
Uh-huh.
How could the people of Nevada decide something that would be in effect in Utah, and how can we fight that?
Well, I'll try and do it very briefly. The aquifers that they want to mine straddle both western Utah and eastern Nevada. And theoretically, Nevada can do whatever they want with their water. But because these aquifers are intermingled and are contiguous, they actually will drain a lot of the aquifers out of both states if they are allowed to. But that isn't the point. The point is, if they're allowed to take a significant amount of water, they will decimate the West Desert. Now, there's a huge difference between the West Desert and the Sahara Desert. If they're allowed to do it, you're going to see the West Desert turn into the Sahara Desert. And every time the wind blows, you're going to have the effects of the Sahara Desert being right next door to us. Now, again, I don't like to dwell on politics any more than I have to, but sometimes you just plain have to. Governor Herbert has taken a position that he wants to sign an agreement with Nevada that will allow them to do that. Our position is no. No, you have to say, we won't agree to that. That's not only a death knell to the communities whose water will be stolen, it is a looming public health disaster on perpetuity for the people along the Wasatch Front. So that email address that I gave you, weigh in on that. Yes?
I must have missed something.
Well, you're not alone.
To me, overpopulation is the problem. And until you publicly admit and say, we have the highest birth rate in the nation, highest fertility rate in the nation, we deliver more babies at Utah Valley Hospital than any place else in the nation, and until we can balance the ecological system with our growth rate and population, we're not going anywhere. And that is the core problem, it seems to me, as the chair of the Public Health Department.
You'll notice my political cowardice in not addressing that.
That did cross my mind.
Yeah, okay. And I freely acknowledge my political cowardice in not addressing that, and don't disagree with anything that you said. Any other questions? Thank you. Yes.
I know in Green River, Utah, that they're building this huge farming complex that entails about 25,000 acres. And I don't know if you've been to that region, but it's kind of deserty and there's not a lot off the Green River. Do you believe that might be okay for them to do because they're doing it for agriculture purposes, or would you be against that kind of action?
Well, I think there's differences in the kind of agriculture that you pursue. If you're growing alfalfa to feed the livestock, I kind of take a dim view of that. But if you're going to create actual, say, a truck farm to grow vegetables and bring them in to the Wasatch Front so people can actually have food locally grown with less transportation costs, less fossil fuels used in getting them there, I think it'd be a great thing. So to me, it depends a lot on what kind of agriculture you're talking about.
The last time I had spoken to them, that like 10,000 acres is going to be devoted to alfalfa, berries.
Well, a whole nother lecture would be what we should be doing with agriculture given our limited water supply. And it isn't growing alfalfa. Vegetables, yes. Alfalfa, not so much.
We'd like to thank
Thank
Dr.
you.
Moench for this lecture, so join with me.